Hey, Emma.
Yes, Madelyn.
Did you hear that they announced that they're going to make 2 sequels to that Dungeons and Dragons movie?
No. What's the title?
Well, wait. I've got more to tell you first.
Okay.
So they haven't, it's weird. They haven't announced casting for the second one, but for the threequel, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is going to be in it.
Oh, what's the title?
Dungeons and Dragons. Baldur's Gate 3. Hello and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your Where's My George Washington Fights Demons game host, Madelyn.
I'm your, we've already got Abraham Lincoln and zombies host, Emma.
Isn't it vampires?
Maybe it's vampire. I don't know.
Whatever. Thanks for tuning in to this week's show. This week, we're talking about Onimusha and Baldur's Gate 3. Thanks for playing along with my multi-part joke.
Yeah, I got one piece of direction, and it was not enough, clearly.
I don't tell Emma the jokes in advance. Which is surprising, right? You'd think that I would, because that would explain why she doesn't just, break down crying with laughter.
Yeah.
But she's just really good at sort of playing the persona of being unimpressed by the humor.
Yeah, that's my role here.
Exactly. So, are you ready to talk about Onimusha? Was this inspired by the recent anime?
I guess so. I don't know.
I always wonder, I'm like, what prompts Emma to put something in the hat?
This one just ended up in the hat, I think.
Well, Onimusha is an action-adventure hack-and-slash from Capcom. Several games in the series. Original one, Onimusha Warlords, for the PlayStation 2 in 2001. Eventually came to Xbox and Windows, but only in China and Russia. Sure. And then there was a remaster that came out for last generation platforms in 2018.
Yes. Like many Capcom games of this era, started off as an idea for Resident Evil.
I loved that.
So it sort of falls in between the Resident Evil, well, the pre-4 Resident Evil and Devil May Cry, in that it still has some survival horror type aspects and puzzles and stuff, along with tank controls. But it has more of an action-based combat system, and you use a sword like you do. I guess you also use a gun in Devil May Cry, but you do use a sword.
I do love for Resident Evil that it's, I think both the titles Resident Evil and Biohazard, which is what it's called in Japan, I think those are both sick titles.
They're very good, yeah.
And I especially they were talking in some of this stuff about Sengoku Biohazard, and I really like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they really probably should have, Onimusha is good, Demon Warrior, sure, great. Sengoku Biohazard, instant buy.
Yeah, sure.
This is actually another game, by the way. I can't remember what game I said this about recently, but it was something on the podcast where, look, I suspect that the tank controls are going to be way too tanky. And I know in the remaster, they have an option to not play tank. But this is the kind of game where if it had come out in, late 2010s, and somehow we were talking about it in the show, it would be much further up my, I would be interested in seeing what this is, than it coming out in 2001.
It's a pretty short game, for what it's worth, the first one.
I have to think about it. It did just appear this week in the Capcom little survey of what games do you want us to see do more with or remake. Okami also on there. And every time I see that, I'm like, heck yeah, more Okami. And then I think to myself, I have never finished the first one. I have failed 3 times to finish the first one.
Well, Onimusha, when it first came out, very successful.
Very successful.
PS2 game to reach 1 million sold, apparently.
It was gonna be, they had a half-finished version for the PlayStation, but
yeah.
They were too late, and they had to swap to PS2.
Yeah.
And it is sometimes listed as one of the best PS2 games.
Yeah, people quite like the first one, especially, I believe. But before we get into like versions and stuff and production history too much, do you want to give us the story summary?
Sure. So Onimusha is one of the like long lineage of Japanese games that are about fabled periods in Japanese history, right? So it's set in the Sengoku period, the Warring States period. At some point, I really ought to learn this history better. I recognize the names of people and the names of periods, but I don't, like, this is not a period of history where I could actually tell you. Like, it's like, oh yeah, Oda. Like, that's a guy whose name I recognize.
Right.
Apparently, he's a sort of, like, you can think of him as both a hero or a villain. This game, definitely villain. But both of these guys, so it's set in the Sengoku period, this, like, Warring States, end of feudalism in Japan sort of moment. Focusing on Samanosuke Akechi versus Nobunaga Oda, right? And Samanosuke, like, they're both very real historical figures. Like, Oda is, like, very, very significant, like, unifier guy. And Samanosuke is based on Akechi Hidemitsu, whose, like, court name was Samanosuke.
Yeah, it's like it was like his role, like his title, his job title.
Yeah.
I believe.
Who was a guy who worked for, and I like, is this a coincidence? Right? So his name is Akechi Hidemitsu, and he was the retainer of Akechi Mitsuhide.
I imagine they were probably in the same clan.
I was just like, that's not confusing at all. Anyway, yeah, so he worked for this guy, and Mitsuhide was, like, in real history, the guy who assassinated Oda and, like, led an uprising against him. So anyway, the real Samanosuke, by the way, is also apparently very famous for committing seppuku and using his own blood to write a poem on the wall.
Beautiful.
Which is not something I think that appears in the game.
I think that they take liberties with their historical figures. Oh, for sure.
Sure. A lot of demons in this telling. So, yeah. Anyway, this guy is the ancestor of Sakamoto Ryoma, best known for his appearance in the Like a Dragon series. Yes. Not historically significant in any other way.
The Sengoku period, by the way, 15th and 16th centuries, in case you wanted to place it somewhere.
Thank you, Emma.
I've always been like, it's an interesting cultural difference between here and Japan, which is maybe just because American history doesn't actually go that far back. Perhaps this is why. But there are so many stories where they just take real historical figures and just do whatever they want with them.
Yeah.
Which I feel like there was a trend in that around when I was, like, in middle school here. Yeah. Like, the reference, there was the Abraham Lincoln fights, whatever.
Vampire Hunter. Abraham Lincoln.
Vampire Hunter. But it's just, like, very ubiquitous in Japanese media.
Oh, you were thinking of Pride and Prejudice and zombies. That's where the zombies came from.
You're right. That's probably it. That was also part of it, yeah.
Yeah. No, I really, whenever we talk about one of these games, like, let's see. I mean, Romance of the Three Kingdoms is obviously, like, the Chinese equivalent, right? Yeah. But we've talked about other, I mean, apart from, obviously, the Like a Dragon ones that I would like to play, I will someday play. But we talked semi-recently about some kind of other, either Japanese or Chinese sort of alt history game. I mean, I can't remember what it was, but that's okay.
I'm not sure
it doesn't
either.
really matter. But anytime we talk about these, I feel bummed to live in a, like, 100% colonial country that has no mythology of its own.
It's interesting, though. Like, you know, around the time Ishin re-release, there was, like, I read a few things about, like, the whether lionizing Sakamoto Ryoma, as many games and stories often do, is really, like, historically accurate to the way those guys were.
Sure.
And so there's ups and downs. On the other hand, it's fun, right? It's fun to like take these historical figures and play around with them. Particularly if you're going like far back in history where, I don't know, you're probably not offending anybody's ancestors at that point. But there's also a little bit of like mythologizing, also overwriting like actual history at the same time.
Sakamoto Ryoma, though, I won't get too far afield here, but he's the ancestor of the guy depicted, or he's the descendant of the guy depicted in this game, so somewhat not totally irrelevant. Is interesting because he lived in like the 18th and 19th century,
right?
I think. Which, you know, sometimes I'm like, there's no way that like America could do this because, yeah, you really have to be pulling from like way back for it to feel. But like that guy's all over the place. That guy's in everything. He's shooting people with guns. Like, why can't, like, it's like, okay, if he can do that, why can't I have a Benjamin Franklin game where he wields lightning to fight, I don't know, demons?
I do see occasionally whenever this gets talked about on Twitter too that like they should make like a John Brown game.
Oh, sure. Yeah, the gamers would love that. The gamers would not have any trouble with John Brown.
Yeah.
That wouldn't. Or like a Harriet Tubman game.
That too, yeah. Well, you'd get an appropriate team on it, obviously.
Like, would also be cool to see, you know, a take on, like, indigenous culture in America. And, like, that's another thing, right? It's like, I mean, whatever. Like, obviously there's a lot of colonial history in Japan, and there's people in Japan who, like the Ainu people and all that. I'm not trying to be like, beautiful homogenous Japan. Nothing under the surface there. But it does help to have a mythology that you can culturally draw into that isn't just like the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah.
Anyway. So yeah, in this version though, so that's the real version, right? These guys fighting, and eventually, you know, the shogunate gets reinstated. But in this game, Oda dies in a battle, or appears to die in a battle anyway, is believed dead. And Semenosuke, you know, was a part of this battle. And he gets a letter from his cousin, the Princess Yuki, who's like, people are disappearing from my court. Like, can you come check it out? And he does. And while he's there, 12 Oni, which, fun fact, in the original English release were translated as ogre, which is funny to me.
I feel like that's still a common, way to describe it in translation.
Sure. I just think ogre is funny no matter what.
That's like the closest. If it's not the same thing, that's like the closest to Western mythology that is the Oni.
Like 12 Shreks show up.
Yeah, exactly.
And they say, hey, we're going to give you the power to vanquish the Genma, who are these demons who abduct the princess. And you can like collect their souls in this gauntlet. While he's looking for the princess, he discovers the Genma have also brought Oda back to life. And you know, you gotta fight them and collect them and try to kill Oda in the process. It's interesting to me. They all have like Shakespeare names. These Genma.
Yes. Very funny. Weird.
Like, what's up with that?
Weird pull.
I like couldn't figure out why it was like they're all named after characters from Hamlet.
And there's not anything really sinister about the device that you're using.
Yeah.
It's not bad. They're not trying to trick you or anything. At least not in the first game.
Anyway, in the end, Samanosuke briefly transforms into a title drop Onimusha, demon warrior, and kind of encounters Oda, but doesn't manage to destroy him. But basically, it's just a lot of hack and slash, slurping up demon souls.
You also have a partner.
Yes, a lady ninja.
Kaede.
Who you play as sometimes.
Yes. She can do combat. It's fun. She can do just as well as your main character, even without all the gathered demon souls. So really, clearly, she should have been handling things the whole time.
Seriously.
And there's also like puzzle rooms as well, where sometimes you have to switch between the two characters to solve puzzles, or sometimes Samanosuke gets locked in a flooding room and you have to try and solve the puzzle before he drowns in it, for example.
Let him drown.
No, because then it'll take you all the way back to the beginning of the puzzle gauntlet you had, and you can't skip the cutscene. It's really the Riku fight for Capcom heads.
Oh boy. Anyway, as Emma said, this game was very successful on release. Both, like, in Japan particularly, but was successful in the West to some extent as well. Also was made at a time where, like, the sequel was developed at the same time as the original, which is just a different world than we live in now. Like, alongside the original by a different team. Can you imagine? Can you imagine anyone now? Yes, 2002 sequel called Samurai's Destiny, or Onimusha Samurai's Destiny, rather, and a trilogy. It was originally planned as a trilogy released in 2004 called Demon Siege. They ultimately made a fourth one called Dawn of Dreams, which was supposed to sort of start a new story, but that was pretty much the last one they made. There are a bunch of other little spin-offs in there, too.
Yeah, people did not like Dawn of Dreams, as I gathered.
Well, so both, like, the sequel, like, okay, fine. Like, new protagonist, a guy named Jubei Yagyu, his whole village gets killed by the Genmas, and so he tries to hunt down Oda and kill him, but because he doesn't have that, little gauntlet to collect his soul in and, like, slurp it up, he can't kill Oda at the end. And so the story continues. But 3 is weird. What a wild way to try to appeal to the West. Did you read about this?
I did. Yeah.
This, like, hey, we wanna sell more games in America, but especially in Europe, because we did really badly in Europe. This is me as the dev team.
Right.
So what we're gonna do is, this game that's about this very specific history in, the end of feudal era in Japan. Let's add some time travel to modern France.
Heck yeah.
With, like, a big French actor playing a French guy who
To be fair, that was, beyond the French part, one of the big things of Onimusha was, like, the main character was, like, portrayed by, like, this actor, and it looked like the actor, and they used motion capture and facial capture for the characters even.
No, it's all very ahead of its time. For sure.
I just mean, if they were bringing in a French guy, of course they were going to pick a French actor to do it.
It's even weirder the more you think about it, right? Like, this French guy appears in, like the late 1500s in Japan, right? Like, Japan is not, like, open to the West at this point, right? Like, this guy, who is this guy?
It sends Samanosuke to France as well.
Yeah, and then
they
you have
switch
all these
places.
puzzles you have to solve with, like, time travel. Like,
yeah.
Like, Link, like, Oracle of Ages style. Yeah, but they did this. And, like, at first I just read about it and I was like, that's crazy. Like, that's a crazy way to have made your game. That, like, you're Samanosuke again and, like, he basically accidentally gets teleported to modern France and a French guy gets teleported here. Like, I was like, that's a weird idea. And it's even weirder when you read about that they did it because they thought it would make more people in Europe buy the game.
It is funny.
And it did not work.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I simultaneously see the logic of the idea, and also I'm like, but that wouldn't work.
There was a little blurb that was like, this guy who was their first producer from outside of Japan at Capcom was like, I don't know, guys. I don't know if this is a good idea.
One of the videos I watched said that they thought this was like a starting point for like the Souls games.
Yeah.
Which I see.
Well, it was an inspiration for Devil May Cry. Did I say that weird?
Yes.
I can't stop myself. I really think of it as like it's uncertain if he's gonna cry. Devil May Cry. Sorry, everyone. In my interpretation, it's much more. He may or may not, cry. But yeah, it did inspire that because it was Kamiya, who's like the guy there, was like working at Capcom, right? And he saw a version of one of the Onimushas where there was a bug where like the enemies would fly up into the air, and he was like, I want to make a game where that happens, and then he did. He said this in an interview.
Okay, a couple of fun facts. The Xbox version for Onimusha came out like a year after or something the PS2 one. And this was in the era when we would have like big differences between different versions on different hardware. So the Xbox could handle like it was higher power than the PS2 for one thing. So there were like more enemies on screen sometimes. And they made it so enemies would show up in different places and like things were stronger. But one of the big things they added was they added an unkillable stalking enemy to one of the sections where you would find like a demon doll that would chase you through like a palace and you would just have to avoid it. Resident Evil style of that time, right?
I'm glad they cut that from the remaster.
But very funny to just think like, yes, they just released a version on Xbox that was just like, it's harder.
Get good.
It's the hard version. Very funny. Other, I guess, fun fact, I don't know. Very funny story about the composer.
Yeah, I knew that's what this is going to be. Go on.
This game. So for a while, this was credited to the composer, Mamoru Samnagochi, who didn't do a lot of video game soundtracks. He was just kind of like a composer who made music. But Onimusha was one of the soundtracks that he supposedly did. And he was also allegedly deaf. He presented himself as deaf.
Beethoven style.
But was in fact not deaf and also hadn't composed like any of the music that he said he did.
Oh, I didn't clock the first half of that. I didn't realize that he was not deaf. I knew that it was like, oh, everything was ghostwritten, but I thought that was
there was like he got interviewed by a magazine called Era that was like he was answering questions before sign language interpretation was finished, and he stood up to answer his doorbell. Without any prompting by anybody. So there was a little bit of suspicion starting to go, although that interview wasn't published at the time. So it went on for a little bit longer. But in fact, all of the music he had written was ghostwritten by a guy named Takashi Niigaki. And he revealed this when one of Samuragochi's old compositions was going to be used in the 2014 Winter Olympics by a figure skater. So there you go. That's the fun composer story, I guess.
Like reacting to a doorbell feels like a great like failed skill check.
Yeah.
Like situation to like get a little ahead of ourselves here. Another fun fact to harken back to our weird controllers episode, they did have a special soul controller made for 3, which was like a 3-foot long sword with a DualShock attached.
We gotta bring that back.
I know.
We gotta bring back the weird little gimmick controllers.
But like, if we did, the gamers will just be like, oh, cash grab. Cash grab.
Well, anything else to say about Onimusha? It got a Netflix TV show recently. Apparently,
Yeah, Netflix 3D CGI anime thing came out in November, but it seems like it's a very loose adaptation from the little I read about it because it's about Musashi fighting demons.
Musashi has previously appeared in other like surrounding like a manga, I believe, is where they introduced his character in the Onimusha timeline. And he was also in the fighting game.
Right, yes, there was a fighting game.
Yes.
2003.
So in that sense, like, he has been previously introduced. It's just not like a direct adaptation of one of the games. But I did read some things that's like, it doesn't really play well with Onimusha's established lore. Like, it introduces the idea of, like, maybe sucking demon souls is bad, which has never actually been an element of Onimusha before. And apparently the reviews were like, it's kind of bad to it's fine. Was where I got of it. So very uninspiring, but at least shows that perhaps Capcom is interested in the franchise, the name itself, for any Onimusha game fans out there.
This is another one in the recent Talk This canon of it had 3 games in rapid succession in the aughts and was never heard from again.
I mean, a 2018 remaster is not that far away.
No, I know that.
That far back.
I know that. That's what I mean. It made a bunch of games and they haven't had a genuine new entry for almost 20 years.
There you go. That's fine.
But yeah, so close to some. Well, like, were I not facing down like many giant games, and were I not carrying the guilt of like not playing Baldur's Gate 3 for this episode already, I thought about buying that $20 remaster. I was like, maybe I would enjoy this.
Hey, it's on Switch. What? You gotta get some games on your Switch to carry over with you to Spain HQ.
You're right. What is HQ in Spanish? I'm going to figure that out before I get over there. Yeah, no, I know. That's true. Maybe. I'll have to watch a little bit of it to see like how tanky it is or how the not tanky goes. But look, let's get to the second half of the episode. Where to even begin with Baldur's Gate 3?
Speaking of having 2 games and then not having another one for 20 years or whatever.
Yeah, seriously.
Is that how it worked with the series? I think they had like some like spin-offs, but
yeah, but the original Baldur's Gate 3 was slated for release in like 2004.
Yes, the very different Baldur's Gate 3.
Yes, with Roman numerals.
Yes, the one with Roman numerals in it. Well, it's a Baldur's Gate 3 came out last year, developed and published by Larian Studios in partnership with Wizards of the Coast, obviously. It's a part of the Baldur's Gate series, which is based on the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. Baldur's Gate 3 uses the 5e rulebook with some adjustments. Some adjustments for video game format.
No, the most notable one that people mentioned were like, it makes the combat so you don't lose so much.
See, I don't believe that. I cannot imagine the combat where I lose more.
Uh-huh.
Maybe I just suck. I just suck at the game, for what it's worth. I watched a couple reviews that were like, this game's kind of easy. I was like, shut up. You stupid. What do you mean it's easy? Dying to the same fight 5 times in a row. Anyway, it was out in early access for several years, like 2.5, 3 years, starting in October 2020, and then it released first for Windows in August, and then in September for consoles and Mac, I believe.
Xbox in December.
Oh, right. There was some trouble with Xbox because they had to make adjustments for the Xbox Series S version, where you cannot play local co-op.
Controversial. The return of console-exclusive editions.
You're right. Yeah.
Shocked me that you can play this on the Mac, which I guarantee that Clickbait Boyfriend doesn't know, because every time I mention this game to him, he's like, "Ugh, I really want to play Baldur's Gate 3."
I don't know if it would run on his Mac.
His Mac is even older than mine. Yeah.
Yeah.
His Mac, where he has 200 tabs open at any given time, I guarantee it would not run.
I think it would have trouble, perhaps. Yeah.
I think it would be worth a try.
But yeah, local co-op in this one.
Everything I read about co-op makes it seem like that is not the way to play the game.
Yeah. It's certainly not the way to play the game, like, for your first time through.
Yeah.
Because it's not really designed well for it, at least.
It'll be a good game for the two of us who have played separately on separate continents. Not that he will ever... I mean, he would have to get a better computer, I guess. But then we could come together and play it.
Yeah.
Wherever the next HQ is.
Yeah. It does seem like a fun thing you could do, like, on another playthrough, rather than making that your main one. But anyway...
RIP to the Stadia version, by the way.
Yes, it was originally going to be released on Stadia, and then Stadia died. Rest in peace, the Stadia.
Also, RIP to anyone who had Game Pass hopes.
Yes.
Sven Larian was like, never, ever, ever, no.
I think it's Vink.
He's like, like a game character.
Sure, yeah, right. Sven Baldur's Gate 3.
Exactly.
So you can either, in Baldur's Gate 3, you can start a campaign with your own character, a customizable character called the Dark Urge, or you can pick one of the origin characters to work with who would otherwise be companions that you can pick up throughout the game. So you can either build your own, or you can take a sort of a pre-written one, or you can build your own with like an extra story tagged onto it, essentially.
An extra story where you want to kill.
Yeah, where you really, really want to kill things is the Dark Urge one.
Yeah.
The basic premise is you awaken on a mind flayer ship, and you've been injected? I don't know. They've put it in your brain, with a mind flayer tadpole, which is supposed to infect you and turn you into a mind flayer within like 2 days, tops. However, you quickly come to realize that something's weird with your mind flayer tadpoles, because you are not in fact showing any symptoms of a mind flayer transformation. And in fact are awakening to strange new powers, perhaps related to your tadpole.
Has anyone commented how this breakout narrative hit of the year seems to take direct inspiration from the game that invented narrative?
It's not quite like that.
I'm just kidding. Go on. That's just for
like
the
that.
long time Talk This listeners. Go on.
That was it. That's the setup of the game. You can pick up various companions who are also on the ship and have been injected with mind flayer tadpoles. They all have their own opinions about the tadpole situation. They all also have their own sort of personal stories going on that really come into focus later down the line. There's other stuff happening as you pick up and go. I don't know. I'm like, in my playthrough, before I put it down, I'm like almost to the end of Act 1.
And this all takes place in the Forgotten Realms, which is like the D&D world.
Yes, mostly in the Swords Coast area. And you do not get, in fact, to Baldur's Gate until close to the end of the game, which I think is pretty much tradition for the series.
So many things here that tied into various recent Talk This side quests, right?
Yes.
We were talking about party composition a couple weeks ago, right?
Yes.
And I do wonder, we talked a little bit in there about like challenges for this in real live tabletop role playing and challenges for party, cohesion in games. And I do like, how many live tabletop campaigns have stolen this like, you all have like a brain thing or an infection or something in the past 6 months that you have to cure together. I was like, that's good. That's a pretty good one. That's a pretty good, like, dumb player proof, you have to work together situation.
The actors for the main characters, I think, have did a D&D show also. Yeah. If anybody wants more.
Well, and there is a Baldur's Gate like inspired D&D campaign.
Yes.
Or like prequel campaign, maybe.
Yes, there's a prequel campaign that released before the game.
Do you think that they were like contractually obligated to hire Matthew Mercer?
Yeah.
Like, right?
I think all games have to hire Matthew Mercer.
That's true.
I don't think it matters what. I think if you're making a video game, you have to at least reach out to Matthew Mercer.
Right, and be like, are you interested?
Yeah.
It gets very annoying for him. He's like, there's too many games. It gives a whole new meaning. There's too many games.
Yeah.
No, I just meant, as Matthew Dungeon, right? I was like, oh, of course he has to be in this one. He is not the Dungeon Master, though.
For Baldur's Gate 3 in particular, in sort of like a Fire Emblem Three Houses but worse situation, I do think they in fact had to reach out to all English voice actors.
Yes,
working.
It was like 275 voice actors.
Yeah.
In the game.
He's in the Asterion. What's his name? Neil something. Acceptance speech for the Game Awards. He said how many, but I don't remember. But it was 200 something, I believe. Yeah. So because it's fully voice acted, including all like minor characters you can talk to, including I actually wish the Dungeon Master character voice whatever would speak up a little bit more in Baldur's Gate 3. That's like. Yeah. That's my note for my playthrough. I wish that she would talk a little bit more.
Baldur's Gate 3 is wildly, wildly, wildly popular and has the kind of like long tail that all game companies dream of. Mm-hmm. The week after its release, it got 25% of the total Steam gaming time. Like all the total hours people spent on Steam that week, 25% of them were spent playing Baldur's Gate 3. Which is crazy.
Yes, I was reading, they were expecting at launch, 100,000 concurrent players, around the time it launched, and they got, 800,000, which obviously, blew their expectations out of the water. They'd had some concerns that because they had been in early access, that actually would have made the launch less big of a deal, essentially. Mm-hmm. But clearly that was not the case.
It's also the definition of lightning in a bottle. Nobody else could ever make this work. There's no lesson to be learned from this game.
Well, I feel like there's big picture lessons, right? Perhaps if more studios fully functioned like this, that would be good. Yeah. But not something you can do on an individual level, I don't think.
So we talked about, I can't remember what the actual topic of this side quest was. But
we were talking about bugs.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about polished, what being polished.
It was a polished episode, that's what it was.
Baldur's Gate 3, not a very polished game, by the way.
But got a lot of praise for being polished at this point. It was a weird dichotomy of people being like, it's so buggy, it's so polished.
I think now it's in a better state than it was at launch. And I think I will be very happy to go back to the console version because they've revamped inventory management, which was genuinely awful in the console version on launch. So not even just bugs, features, things that they needed to get feedback on and then fix down the line. So very funny. It's just a very funny game. It doesn't have any at least it doesn't have very frequent game breaking bugs. But it is, especially as you get closer out of Act 1, which was the early access content, you can see that they did not, in fact, have thousands of people running through it and testing it for them over the course of 2 years. Yeah. Just put it that way.
But beyond this sort of like unique, independently funded or like independent game studio that also has some Tencent money and had a successful early access to fund it, but also like independent wealth potentially, right? That isn't really super replicable. This small indie studio, right? It also, I feel like, is like a laundry list of things gamers hate, right? It's turn-based. It has like hundreds of hours of cutscenes. It has a lot of friction and like complicated systems that are difficult to learn. It practically forces you to save scum, right? So just like over and over and over, it's like, oh, gamers hate that, but everybody loved this.
Very much a case of just managing to do it right.
Do you feel like it's fooling you into feeling like you can do everything? Does that make sense? A lot of people were talking about, like, obviously I can't do whatever I want in this game, but to varying degrees among various reviewers, they felt like it pulled off that sleight of hand, making you feel like you could, varying degrees of well.
Yeah, I think so. The place I had the most trouble with it was definitely the combat, as I've already expressed. I think that if you are more familiar with D&D, it's probably going to be easier for you to manage, but I got like 5 to 10 hours in without really understanding what a spell slot meant. I was like, why can't I cast this anymore? That's so weird. Or like, but I can cast these cantrip things.
Oh, yeah.
So, there's a little bit of that. But, I mean, I think you can do a lot of stuff pretty clearly if you just are running around.
Well, as is almost a requirement, there's definitely some like, well, but it's not as good as playing for real with your friends kind of discussion out there on the internet, to which I have a couple of responses. So yes, like there's a bunch of stuff that's like, it can't be as expansive as playing with your friends.
Yes.
Right, because it's a game. And like, yes, of course. But it also probably can't be quite as like boring as playing with your friends. Right? Like, it's one thing if you and your friends are very seasoned and good Dungeons and Dragons players and you're all like very into the role play and like good actors and whatever. And you've got a great dungeon master. It's another thing if you're like probably the more average person experiencing this, where it's like someone has never played before and you keep having to explain the rules and like,
sure, but I think a lot of the takes around that were coming from people that were like, if you play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, you will see the limitations here. Me, for example, I can't set up my companions to date. They all just want to date Simone.
It's difficult to be that magnetic of a personality, isn't it?
I know. But genuinely, like, my big major complaint is, like, why can't I make Will and Karlak date? I was curious at one point, so I, like, started a campaign, like, with Lae'zel and with Will, I think, and did a little bit of it, just to feel, like, what is it like playing as an origin character? And it's, like, it's really, like, they're not the same because you're playing them, right? Yeah. They have like a backstory and like a different mission as you because they have their own personal quest lines. Whereas if you're playing your own character, you don't have like a personal quest line really. But you're still like the responses aren't like super changed based on who you're playing. So you can't even really do it vicariously that way. It's still like you, the player, are romancing the character.
I also want to put in a vote for Baldur's Gate that it does not, you turn on the computer or the console and then you play it. It actually does not, believe it or not, require you to schedule with your friends, which to me is a huge plus of the entire potential experience, is it does not require you to decide, as was the case in my most like extended D&D experience as an adult, that despite the fact that none of you live in Queens, you're going to meet at a hostel in Long Island City in Queens. that has like an open lobby, even though no one lives in Queens and some people live in Staten Island, to play Dungeons and Dragons there like once every 2 months.
Obviously. That just makes sense, Mel.
I realize that maybe does replicate your experience at Baldur's Gate in that you have taken a break, but you could just turn it on at any given time.
I could. You're right.
Also, I read an interesting piece that I was curious about your thoughts on, as someone who's played some of the games, from John Walker at Kotaku, that was talking about how, like, sometimes the dice rolls, and, like, this is, like, the sort of, like, meme thing of Dungeons & Dragons, right? Like, sometimes the dice rolls make you fail things that don't really make sense to fail. Like, he was like, I rolled the dice and I, like, failed to look at something. But beyond that it's not even just that, but it's that, like, you fail things, but, like, failing is that are, like, really easy, and if, like, you're going to be able to fail something that's really easy, like, he was talking about some opportunity where it's like, I had to try to throw poop at someone, but I had to roll a 10 to be able to successfully throw the poop.
I feel like that's the minimum amount. There's a lot of skill that goes into that, I feel like.
Okay, fair enough, but, like, he was talking about some other things, too. Like, yeah, he was like, there was one time where it's like, I had to roll a 5 to be able to, like, say something correctly to someone. And he was like, it feels like if I'm gonna fail this, that failing has to be in some way more interesting than succeeding. And that often it just means that you're, like, blocked out of something that is more interesting. Which I thought was and also was complaining that you can't see what number you need until you choose the choice. Which I thought was a fair critique.
Yeah. I believe they eventually, or maybe it was a mod. I don't remember if it's an official thing or if it was a mod I was reading about that does let you see, like, what the number is on the dice roll. But yes, I do agree with that it feels a little mean that you can't see, like, what it is until you've already selected it and then you can't go back. I found myself a lot where I would do that. I'd accidentally pick something that was, like, totally unsuited for me because I didn't have my stats memorized. And then it would force me into combat, essentially, because I failed that. So there is a little bit of that, I think. I don't know. I'm not a person who has any, like, moral objection to, like, save scumming or artistic objection to save scumming. So my tip for Baldur's Gate 3 is just, like, mostly go with the flow, but if you're like, oops, I'm forced into combat, just reload your save.
Well, I think what was at the heart of this critique was more, there's a missed opportunity here to have set up some of these dice rolls to create more interesting situations for a player, like a live Dungeon Master would do. Like, I think he was like, you know, it's interesting when your character tries to leap across a small gap that they only need to roll a 3 for, and they roll a 1 and they fall down to the bottom, someplace that the Dungeon Master never thought anyone would ever end up, right? Like, there's something interesting to that. Whereas it seemed like those sorts of, like, very hard to fail failures maybe didn't have consistently, like, some interesting, surprising, that sort of, like, moment of discovery, you know, more of, like, punishing the player for failing than creating a storytelling opportunity.
It's definitely a difficult thing to balance for a game this big with this many things. And sometimes, you know, you might fail something and then not see the consequence of that until farther down the line, right?
Sure.
So there might be some that's easy to judge as being like, oh, this didn't do anything, right? And then it does do something later down the line.
We should probably move soon to mashup, but, you know, I'd be remiss to not mention that, like, you know, in some ways, like, it's a shame for Wizards of the Coast that they, like, hedged their bets on this enough to not put their name, like, front and center all over this, right? Like, I feel like everyone's talking about Dungeons and Dragons, but it's not, like, big there on the box.
Yeah.
But also, you know, this game, like all Dungeons and Dragons things, that maybe someday someone will figure out a way to, like, excise, like, carry some of the, like thorny, like, race things and ideas about race.
Yes. I do think Baldur's Gate 3 carries some of the same weaknesses of Dungeons and Dragons. It's not able to avoid it when it comes especially
it's
to
doing that
racial.
System, so, like, you know, they can't avoid it. That is the system.
Yes. Yeah. They could do something like, I don't know, they could have a goblin as one of the companions.
So there's definitely things that they could do on the, like, addressing the, like, racism that's baked into, like, certain character classes and, like, that sort of thing.
I feel like they could do some stuff around, like, this is just the evil race.
Yes, that they could do more with. I just mean to say that, of course, sort of the heart of this system is this sort of, like, bioessentialist idea that you sort of can't really excise if you're going to use 5e. And that plagues all RPG and all tabletop everywhere.
Yes.
Also, maybe don't teach the gamers they can ask for changes to the ending.
They did, in fact, add an epilogue.
I know, but, like, let's not teach the gamers that.
Oh, this is also an interesting, the case of, like, the fact that they kept updating it after launch. The physical edition is coming out sometime soon, I believe. Yeah. And I'm very curious to see if that becomes a trend with, like, larger releases. Like, if we see an Alan Wake 2 physical release once all the DLC is out, right? Or Hellblade 2 is going to be digital only for a while. Let's see if they have a physical release a year afterwards. Because we have so many games that have to fix themselves after launch, perhaps it makes sense that you want to put the better version of the game on a disc before you sell it.
That's all smoke and mirrors, though, right? Because, like, that game, like, there's nothing about the physical edition that makes it definitive. You can still push patches to it.
Yes, but it has those previous patches.
No, of course. I just mean to say, like, I bet we will see more of this because it seems to me like an obvious way to wring more cash out of people, right?
I mean, sure, that too.
Because, you know, though people who are huge fans will want to play it at launch, and then they might love it so much or be such devotees of physical media that they want to get the physical edition later, and so you trick them into buying 2 copies of the game. And you get to pretend that it's because you want to be able to put out a definitive edition, but of course, in our always online world, there's nothing that stops a physical release from getting those updates too. This is my more of a cynical take on it. I agree. I think we'll see this more often. But I think we'll see it more often because people are going to discover it's a way to get people to buy the game twice.
That's fair. I mean, I just think, Hellblade 2 is a different matter because Microsoft should be able to do whatever they want with that. Although maybe not. I don't know. What's going on with Microsoft? Who knows? But, like, the first 2 examples, like, Larian, and then if Remedy ever does a physical edition of Alan Wake 2, like, maybe they need to wring more money out of people, right? And also they get the added benefit of it's a complete edition on a disc. But we'll see.
Well, ready to mash?
I'm ready to mash.
I think I'll say Dungeons and Dragons, but whatever, like, tabletop inspired take on the Sengoku period would print money.
You're right. Yeah. All done.
Like, I genuinely don't think that I could have a better idea than that.
It's even like a video game, like having like a Baldur's Gate 3, or like if you wanted to go weirder with it, like a Disco Elysium alike that's set in the Sengoku period, would work, I think.
It would be difficult to carry over it wouldn't be difficult for the right audience, but I assume I can't imagine that this is the mainstream take to carry over the romanceability of it into the Sengoku period.
You don't think people want to date Nabunga or whatever?
I do think that they do. I'm worried that perhaps the sort of like everyone's a bisexual
You're right.
version
That's
of this
funny.
might not go over quite as well with these like real, very mythologically coded like warrior guys.
Well, you wouldn't necessarily have to, we could just have it set in that era, right?
Like,
you wouldn't necessarily
yes,
have
but
to pull in the historical figures to make a Sengoku era game.
you're right that we wouldn't have to. However, for my
maybe they wouldn't be in the main party,
I guess so. I guess you're right.
They would be just like characters that influence the plot, but they wouldn't be like your companions necessarily.
Sure. I think the modding...
Except maybe like one or two exceptions, like they bring back some previous characters from previous Baldur's Gate games later in Baldur's Gate 3. That's like the... whatever historical figure you want to put in there.
Tokugawa, Oda, whoever, yeah. No, I think that would be great. I have nothing else to add. I think the big balance would be trying to determine what the Japanese audience, like how far they're willing to go.
I mean, hey man, Bungo Stray Dogs is very popular.
I know. That is what I'm saying, is that like it would have to be the right team making this, because like I'm over here being like whatever, but like someone doing this should be like, actually probably there are some restrictions on how Oda should act, right? Like the balancing and making sure they act appropriately would be tricky. But I think it would sell like gangbusters. And then we could do a Sakamoto Ryoma one.
I mean, like, now's the time over in the West, right?
Yeah.
Japanese culture is in media is really catching on over here.
Yeah, it's a moment for a historical epic here.
Yeah.
So somebody get on this. This is ripe for the taking.
Yeah, I don't even think there needs to be any... We've even got the whatever... Is there a Japanese equivalent of a mind flayer among their demons? Surely. It's not just going to come up if you Google it.
Japanese mind flayer. It just gave me mind of Freya.
Good. Yeah,
not
that's
helpful.
Exactly what you wanted.
Not what I was
I'm sure
looking
there's
for.
something in among their many mythological creatures that would work.
Maybe the mind flayer has made appearances in Final Fantasy? ?
I'm sure they have something called a mind flayer in Final Fantasy, but Final Fantasy steals from other cultures, so...
Yes, it seems to... Final Fantasy seems to have appropriated the mind flayer.
Good.
So.
Alright, I'm glad we did this.
Listeners... Do you think that I could also... How far into history do we need to all continue to survive for me to create a Dungeons & Dragons take on the American Revolution? Like, how far do we have to go? Do you think? How many years need to pass? And what historical events need to transpire?
Hey, we made Hamilton.
That... You're right.
We could
How
do,
far
we
do
can
I
do
have to
whatever
go?
we want now.
Lin-Manuel, if you're listening, are you interested in starring in a video game that is a Dungeons & Dragons take on the American Revolution in the early years of America? Do you think that Onimusha should come back, or that they should at least remaster the rest of their original trilogy? Why am I so resistant to games that are made in the early 2000s, even when they have concepts that seem interesting to me? At what point will I actually begin Baldur's Gate 3? And should I play it with Click Like Boyfriend, or would we tear each other apart? If you have thoughts on any of this or anything else we talked about this week, hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series, Click Like Boyfriend, and Split Screen. But most importantly, if you enjoy the show, you should subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online, and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe, like, review, talk this. It's my side quest next week. It's not my side quest last week. It's my side quest next week. For which if I wanted to be really seasonal, it would be like something about Valentine's Day or like Mardi Gras or something. But it probably won't be very seasonal. I'm sure we've done like romancing games before. But Emma, what will we be talking about in 2 weeks?
In 2 weeks, we will be talking about Kowloon High School Chronicle for our old game.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't done Lies of P yet, right?
No, we have not done Lies of P.
And Lies of P for our new game.
Woohoo!
I have to replace games in the hat. They're getting low.
So send Emma your requests for games in the hat.
Yes. All right. You want to sign us off?
Yeah. This week, I hope you roll a natural 20, unless a nat 1 would be more interesting.